Hello, everyone. So, I went on social media on my Facebook page and I asked for suggestions for topics to do my YouTube fairy videos about. And I actually got a really long list. So, I think it's like over a dozen topics. I'm gonna be trying to get through those and doing new videos on a more regular basis, hopefully, at this point. But the first one that I wanted to start with, which is a topic I'm going to do today, um, hopefully I can keep it to around 20 minutes, is the idea of deals with fairies, or making deals with fairies. Seems to be a bit of a hot topic at the moment. So, I often joke, although I'm not sure how much of a joke it is, that as opposed to fairy doctors, what we really need in modern times is fairy lawyers. And it's not really much of a joke because it's kind of true. A fairy doctor, for those of you that don't know, it's sort of this anglicized concept that we see written about by authors like Yeats and Lady Wilde. Sort of the English language equivalent of the old Banfasa or Cailleach in Irish culture. It would be people who were very knowledgeable about the good neighbors and who could be called in when a person or a family was having problems, either with the good people or with witches or sort of any kind of magical or otherworldly issues. A Banfasa would be called, or a similar, like, wise person would be called in and asked to use their expertise to figure out what the exact problem was and then what the best solution would be. And the sort of English language equivalent that popped up in the 19th and 20th centuries language term for Banfasa was a fairy doctor. With a similar idea of you're trying to cure things that are caused by these beings. So, my humorous take on that, the 21st century, is that as opposed to doctors, we need fairy lawyers. And my whole point with all of that is really that anytime you're looking at or reading stories about or folklore about or considering dealing with fairies, the real key is to approach it the way you would if you were a very, very high-priced, expensive lawyer. Read all the fine print, look at every possible sort of semantic angle to everything, and assume that there's loopholes, assume that there's sort of hidden catches in things, and just be very, very cautious. We have a lot of examples in folklore and even in anecdotal material of fairies making deals with people. Even in the ballads, we see this sort of thing happening. It's best to keep in mind that these deals are always done to the advantage of the fair folk. Even when they come forward sort of with the idea that they're trying to help the human in the situation, they're always doing it ultimately for their own reasons, for their own agenda, and to help themselves for their own advantage. They're not charitable by nature, and when they are, there's an ulterior motive. And this is sort of what the folklore and the stories show us. Although I will say there are stories where we don't ever ultimately know what it is they get out of it. There are stories where they seem to be acting just entirely benevolent. So I don't want to discount that or, make it seem like those stories don't exist. There is one, I believe it's in Yeats' Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, so that would date to about 1888, right around there, that he talks about where a man was looking at eviction. He couldn't pay his rent. Rent used to be due quarterly, so you would have to pay it 4 times a year. and his rent was coming due. He didn't have the money. Knew he and his family were going to be evicted. He had gone to the shore of a lake and was sort of breaking down crying because he didn't know what he was going to do, what his family was going to do. And a strange man approaches him and asks him what's wrong. And of course, he tells him all of his troubles. And the man tells him what to do and basically gives him enough gold to pay the rent, but is very clear that when he does this, he needs to make sure that he gets a written receipt from the rent taker. Because the landlord wouldn't collect the rent directly. He would have a person that would do that, and that person would go around to all the tenant farmers, collect the rent, and then bring that to the landlord. So the stranger was very clear. You need to make sure you get a written receipt for this so that no one can question that you actually did pay. Of course, the farmer's overjoyed, goes and pays, insists on getting the receipt, much to the annoyance of the man collecting the rent. Goes back, is thrilled, he gets to stay, his family's not going to get evicted. And, of course, the man who collected the rent gets up the next morning and finds in place of the gold are gingerbread, exactly in the shape of the coins, stamped like the coins were stamped, but all those gold coins have now turned to gingerbread. Not actually an uncommon thing in some of these fairy stories. But there's nothing he can do about it because the farmer had paid and he had gotten a receipt, so no one could question that he paid. And now it was on the man who collected the rent to try to explain why he didn't have it, where it had gone. Basically, it was now his problem. And the farmer, it is said, ever after that, had a lot of luck and fortune and never had an issue with his rent again. I believe this is generally attributed to one of the kings of the fairies intervening. So, why did he do it? We don't know. What did they get out of it? We don't know. It's a little difficult because there is this sort of code of silence that goes on, particularly when the good people are doing more positive things for people. A lot of the folklore and anecdotes that we have, particularly the Irish, tend to talk about the more negative experiences because there's less of a restriction about talking about those things, whereas talking about the positive, talking about the good things, there is a very deep-seated belief that if you talk too much about blessings that the fair folk give you or positive ways that they intervene in your life, that they will stop doing those things or even potentially turn around and do the opposite. So we don't find as many of the good stories going around as the negative. So it's possible that enough of this story had gotten out to form the basis of this sort of folk tale, if you will, but not the real hardcore details that would tell us what the actual agreement was, what the farmer agreed to, and so on. We do see other examples where we know that specific things were asked. Usually there's a clear requirement that the human in question can violate. And if they violate it, then there are dire consequences, as it were. Sometimes we see the consequence, that's part of the story. Sometimes we don't. The person doesn't screw it up. Not all of these are folk tales. Not all of these are folk tales that get told because there is a big dramatic human screw up that makes the story interesting. Some of these are just anecdotes or things that were passed down almost like fragments, but that don't have that clear storytelling arc of beginning, middle, and end, if you will. Campbell in the Gaelic Otherworld, which came out in 1900, details a story of a boy who did not have the greatest home life, was walking along one day, sort of just generally lamenting his situation, was approached by a stranger who asked him if he wanted to learn how to play the pipes. And he said, of course, that he did, but that he had basically no means to do so. And the stranger told him that he would give him a set of pipes, and that as long as he had the pipes, he would learn how to play and be effectively one of the greatest pipers in Scotland. And naturally, the boy was very excited about this because it was an opportunity he wouldn't have had otherwise. But the catch there, because of course the stranger was one of the fair folk, the catch there was that he had to stay in possession of that particular set of pipes and sort of take care of it and not lose it. If he were to lose it, he would lose his skill to play along with it. So, that was sort of the catch with that one. We don't know what else might have been involved. That's the story as it gets passed down. We see other stories, not along those exact lines, but, similar, in Ireland as well. The Duahish IE site, which is one of my favorite sources of fairy folklore, there's a tale of a man who, a farmer who had some cows, was passing near a fairy fort one day, and a strange man approached him. The man was one of the good neighbors, asked him if he would be willing to come into the fort and stand as a witness for a baptism. Fairy religion, very complicated thing. They do, some of them appear to follow or at least imitate some form of Christianity. Whether or not it was that sort of a baptism is never, really clearly said in the story, but either way, the man agreed that he would go into the fort and participate in the baptism and stand as a witness for this fairy baby. And went in, and when it came time, his part in the ceremony, witnessed for the child, and then was asked what gift was he going to give. And of course, it hadn't even occurred to him what he would give, didn't have anything with him. So one of the fairy people had asked if he would give the baby a milk cow, which of course is very, very valuable in human culture, extremely valuable in fairy culture. We know there's a lot of connection with them and cows. They tend to want cows, particularly cows that are in milk. So the fairy had said that one of the farmer's cows had given birth that day, and that the cow that was born was a heifer, was female, and would the man agree to give that cow as a gift? And the man was like, okay, sure. I will give that cow as a gift to this baby in honor of its baptism. And then he went home and found out that yes, in fact, one of his cows had given birth to a female calf. And he knew then that, that cow was not really his, but he remembered that they had specifically mentioned giving a cow that was in milk. So he ended up keeping the cow and making sure everyone in his family knew that that cow was not to be sold, that cow was not to be harmed in any way. They treated it very well. And when that cow was 2 years old, I believe it was said in the story, she gave birth to her first calf, came into milk, and then died. And the man's interpretation of that was that the fairies had taken her. Now that she was an adult and was a milk cow, which is what he had agreed to give them for the baby, they had taken her and just made it seem like she had died, which is, again, another very common theme. So, this is all just sort of examples of things that we see with people making deals with the fair folk. There's another one that gets mentioned by McNeill in the festival Lunasa, where someone is in need of grain and they don't have the money to buy it, to plant, but they have to plant it so that they'll have a harvest or their farm will go under, sort of a dire situation to be in. And in desperation, they go to this particular crossroads where they know a former human who is now a member of the fairies is known to be seen, has been spotted. And finding this particular person, they ask if they can make a deal with the good people to borrow that amount of grain. And the deal is struck with the understanding that it must be repaid a year and a day from the time that it's borrowed, which of course would give the farmer enough time to plant it, grow the crop, harvest the crop, hopefully make enough to keep their farm afloat and put enough aside to repay the fairies. They're very big sticklers on being properly repaid. So I'm just tossing out a variety of different examples that we have in folklore and anecdotes of people making deals with the fairies. These are all successful deals, I should point out, things that go well. But sort of the theme that we see here overall is either the fairies come to the person and ask for a deal, if the person will participate in something or give them something, and that tends to be a little more straightforward. Or the person themselves is in some sort of dire strait and really is in need of aid, physical aid, by the way. These stories are not symbolic or metaphoric in any way. These were people who, needed physical items, whether it's money or seed for a crop or what have you. And I guess we could even include musical skill. It's not quite physical, but kind of. Either way, the fairies in this case are willing to help the humans, give them the things that they need in order to get out of the terrible situation or difficult situation that they're in, but there's always some kind of cost or payment that's expected. In the case of the farmer borrowing the seed, it was that it had to be repaid on a certain timeline, and it was essential that the timeline be met. In other cases, we might not know anymore exactly what was required, but sort of anytime you're dealing with fairies or anytime you're reading stories or seeing stories about people dealing with fairies, it's important to keep in mind that there's always a cost. They don't ever do anything for free. Folklore, anecdotes, all of that reinforces this. Everything is sort of this symbiotic relationship, reciprocal relationship. If you're going to get something, then you're going to give something. And when you're making deals with them or what have you, it's important to remember just a couple essential sort of basic facts. At least in my experience and in everything I've ever read, they are strictly honest in their speech. They do not tell verbal lies, but that doesn't mean they cannot mislead you by telling you the absolute truth. They can get very into semantics and twist what's true so that you come to an untrue conclusion. So you do have to be very careful about exactly what's being said and how it's being said. Don't read too much into things or jump to conclusions. Listen very carefully or read very carefully. Don't try to put too much subtext into anything. Don't make assumptions. You want to really look at what is actually being said or what is actually being promised or what is actually being agreed to and go with that. I think that's where a lot of people get tripped up, not only in the folklore and the anecdotes and fairy tales, but just, generally speaking. They also don't take being lied to very well. I think because, they don't lie. They have this honesty thing going on. Verbal lies are not something they do particularly well with. And that is another thing we see in folklore. It can give the impression that they can be very easily tricked, I think, but that's a false impression. It's just that they assume that whatever you're saying to them is true. And so they react badly to finding out it's not. There's a fairly famous story of a brownie. It's one of the more well-known one that goes around where it was a brownie who haunted a mill who lived in a mill, and a young woman, girl, it's a little unclear on what her age was, we'll go with young woman, had gone to the mill in the evening after everyone else had left to grind her wheat. And the brownie was being pretty much just a straight creeper and really concerning her. And in the course of sort of talking to her, had asked her what her name was, and being a little concerned by how he'd been acting up to that point, and knowing that it's not usually a good idea to give the fair folk your actual name, she had instead answered, Mamisha, me, myself, and you have to forgive me, I have a bit of a cold, so I'm very stuffed up. She answered me, myself, and so he, of course, believed that that was actually her name. And he ended up basically trying to assault her in the story. So she threw boiling water on him, and he fled back to his mother, Meg Moloch, who's the one the story is usually named for. And when she was, sort of desperately asking who had done this to you, who did this to you, all he could say is, it was me, myself, because that was the name the girl had given him, the young woman had given him. So that's one example of, just that belief that they will have in things that humans say, being honest and straightforward, because that's how they tend to speak. This also means, though, that when you're dealing with them, you want to keep in mind that you can't lie to them, because they're not gonna be okay when they figure out that you were lying. If you promise a thing, you have to follow through with that thing. If you make an agreement, you have to follow through with that agreement. It has to be in good faith. You can't agree to something with the intention that you're going to get out of it later. You really have to go into things with that being honest in your words. If you say you're going to do it, then that means that you intend to do it. Because otherwise, it's really not going to go well. It's when you lie, or when you don't hold up your end of the bargain, or break a promise or break an oath, the reaction tends to be just profoundly, catastrophically bad. Sort of hard. I'm trying to think quickly of like a good example of this from folklore or an anecdote. We don't see too many, because the majority of the time people just sort of do what they've agreed to do. But, think along the lines of, they'll burn your house down, they'll drive you mad, they'll take away all your physical health, things like that. I guess one example we could give is the fairy midwife trope. The midwife who gets brought to deliver a fairy baby and is told to put ointment on the baby's eyes but not to touch her own eyes. And of course, in the course of anointing the baby's eyes, accidentally rubs one of her own eyes, usually unintentionally. As soon as she does so, she's granted true sight and can see that she's actually among the fairies. Usually it turns out the woman who she just delivered the baby for is a girl from her village who's thought to be dead. So she kind of quickly figures out that nothing is what it seems. But generally she gets back to her own home safely. That's fine. But, so the stories usually go, there's many, many variations of this across the different Celtic-speaking countries. She eventually is at some sort of fair or market and sees the fairy father among the people, and can't resist, for whatever reason, greeting him and asking how the baby and the mother are doing. And he initially responds politely, but then asks her which eye can she see him out of. And for whatever reason, she responds and tells him, oh, this one. At which he immediately blinds her. Sometimes just blinding the eye that has the fairy sight, sometimes just completely blinding her. And we see that not only in that particular story, which is kind of a trope, but we also see some anecdotal accounts along those same lines of people who were blinded because they did something they shouldn't, saw something they shouldn't, broke a promise, that sort of thing. There's at least one account of a woman in Scotland who had a Lonanshi, a fairy lover, who had been told part of her deal with him for having him as her lover was that she was not to speak of him to anyone else. And she eventually gave into the temptation and told her sister, making her sister first promise that her sister wouldn't tell anyone else. And of course, her sister told everybody. So he then abandoned her, because she had broken her promise, but she also went mad and lost her mind and went running off into the wilderness. So, there we see kind of the two consequences. Because she broke her word, not only did she lose the person that she was in love with, but she also went mad. So, this is all sort of under the wider subject of dealing with fairies. It can be fairly simple and straightforward if you keep it simple and straightforward. Just important to keep in mind those basic guidelines. Always read the fine print. Always be honest. Always understand that everything they say is the truth, but that doesn't mean that you can trust it. You need to always look for, the deeper meaning behind the words. Always look for the loopholes. Always look for what is in it for them. And what is it really going to cost you? Nothing is free. There's always a cost. So I think if you kind of keep those things, specific things in mind, or look for those patterns if you're reading the folklore and the stories, then you have a much better chance of successfully dealing with them. Dealing with them in the sense of asking them for something that you need. I recommend doing this in more dire or desperate situations as opposed to just casual. But they do tend to approach people who are desperate. We see that a lot in the Scottish witchcraft trials, the idea that they would come to people who are in really desperate situations and make offers. And sometimes the cost of those particular deals was the person's soul, in the sense of the person committing to service to the fairies forever, which is a much more serious undertaking than people might think it would be. Also important to keep in mind, if you make that particular deal, the odds are good you're going to spend eternity scrubbing a fairy chamber pot somewhere. Not, doing whatever the romantic, urban fantasy, young adult fiction would kind of paint the picture of you doing. Folklore and ballads and anecdotal material are pretty clear that when humans get taken into fairy, it's usually not for the benefit of the human. I could do a whole video about that too. So, just keep in mind, like I said at the very beginning, be your own high-priced lawyer. Look for every single thing that's going to be to your own advantage, and keep in mind every single thing that's going to be to your detriment in all of this. And just never forget that they are always going to be looking for how every single aspect of it can benefit themselves. So, don't get suckered into giving away everything in exchange for nothing. There's a saying that goes around sometimes about the goblin market, which is a poem by Christina Rossetti that has then kind of taken on sort of a life of its own past that. But there's a saying that goes on sometimes about the goblin market that you can never buy anything in the goblin market that you don't already own. And whatever you pay for it is going to be more than you're willing to part with. And I think that also really sums up well what it's like dealing with the fair folk. So, I know that's ending this on a bit of a downer, but all food for thought and things to keep in mind, whether you're reading the material or actively engaging with these powers. Not trying to fearmonger or anything, and as always, not telling people what to do or what not to do, but just trying to make sure everyone is prepared and in the best position to make the best possible decisions. So, on that note, like I said, I have a very long list now from social media of topics. So I will try to do at least one video a week until I run out of my list. Have a good day.